It's my utmost pleasure this evening to welcome Mr. Parik Schumacher, Principal of Zaha Hadid Architects, one of the leading voices in contemporary architecture, both in architectural theory and practice. Our aim as faculty here has always been to organize lectures that promote and encourage critical debate, especially on modern architecture, the current state of our profession, and how architectural schools should respond to disciplinary changes. I'm confident that tonight's lecture will raise an important questions and create an opportunity for an engaging discussions between us tonight. I would like to express my gratitude to our colleagues who helped connect us with Mr. Schumacher and organize this lecture, Professor Bojanic and Professor Vesnic. And of course to you, Professor Schumacher, for accepting our kind invitation to be here with us and for your time and willingness to share your valuable experience with us tonight. And your presence here is very well appreciated tonight. Thank you. I will now invite Professor Vesnic to say something about Professor Schumacher's biography and something about tonight's selection. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Dean Bojanica. It is a great honor for me to introduce tonight's lecturer, Parik Schumacher. Parik Schumacher is one of the most influential figures in contemporary architectural discourse. He is both practicing architect and an architect theorist. He serves as a principal of Zaha Hadid Architects, and he will always remain a key figure in the history of this office as Zaha Hadid's closest collaborator. I'm sure there is no need to introduce this office as land, so let me just say its global significance is evident in its impressive avant-garde projects built all over the world and in the many awards they have received from them. In addition to design practice, Parik has been teaching since 1996 at the Architecture Association School of Architecture in London, where he co-founded his design research laboratory, and he has also taught at universities in Berlin, Innsbruck, Vienna, Harvard, and elsewhere. He holds a PhD from the University of Heidelberg. He is the author of the two-volume work, The Autopoiesis of Architecture, and most recently, Tectonism, Architecture for the 21st Century. He is the 2025 laureate of the European Prize of Architecture. I should also say that earlier this year I had the opportunity to be guest critic at the AA Design Research Lab thesis reviews and visit the Zaha Hadid Architect Studio in London, which was very insightful and helped me better understand Parik's work as a teacher and as an architect. Tonight's lecture is titled Architectural Research, Formal and Functional. It focuses on the methodology and pedagogical work developed within Parik's teaching at the Design Research Lab at AA. I believe we will have the opportunity to hear engaging reflection on contemporary trends in architecture, since Parik, as an architectural thinker, has always sought to define, explain, and position himself in reflection to the emerging modes of architectural practice. I'm particularly pleased that this lecture is taking place within the framework of our master course, Architectural Philosophy, where questions about theory, design research, and practice are always at the center of discussion. Before I hand over to Parik, I would just like to mention that this evening's lectures is only the first of series of events where we will have the opportunity to hear a theme. Tomorrow at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory, there will be a seminar dedicated to the Parik's book, which we will soon publish with the Foreign Book Series. After that, you probably know, on Saturday, the Architecture Forum will take place, where Parik will be the special guest. Please join me now in welcoming our guest, Parik Schumacher.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Snezana, and also thank you to the Dean. Thank you for giving me that platform. Happy to be here at such a prestigious university. So I will talk about architectural research, formal and functional. You see the functional have kind of faded off a bit because I might not get to this. But anyway, that's more understood in any way that you would do research to improve and optimize the functionality of the built environment, of architecture, etc. And I would distinguish in terms of the functional side between technical functionality, which is engineering business, and that has separated out as a specialism, and social functionality, which is our domain. In both respects, you actually need formal research. That doesn't make sense in and of itself. It just develops the resources of solving functional problems. Formal repertoires are problem-solving repertoires. And they are non-trivially, they're not given, they're not obvious. You need to elaborate them, expand them, and that is something which is not often understood. Okay, so I start with the relationship between modern art and architecture, because I locate in my understanding and theory of art is that modern art and contemporary art are connected with, not 100% taking over, but are connected with and contributing to the formal research of all the design disciplines. Let me see if okay, now I will not talk about these images, so let them kind of sink in what it means to say that we have an expanded repertoire of forms, morphologies, spatialities, which is quite dramatically different from what maybe one is usually known to understand to be a piece of architecture, a building. I'm not sure if, let's say, this kind of expansion, this dramatic kind of new level of versatility in the organizational patterns and forms and arrangements under the heading of architecture is what this should just illustrate for now. And that's a massive expansion. All of these are our works, but obviously other companies have contributed this. And this basically happening started in the 20th century and very, very little before that. Before the 20th century, you had kind of 1,000 years or 2,000 years of more or less stable repertoire. And now we can really be extremely versatile. It's like the endless forms of nature, I would like to say. Particularly in the last 30 years, this started to really expand. But there were some other potential expansions up to that. So yeah, this is not, can't be put back into a kind of simple set of typologies which you are familiar with and you can sample from the European city of the 19th century. Oh, wait a second. I wanted to just throw in a video as well. So, yeah, so you can really, it's a very open-ended field of creation, but it's all functionally driven in the end. Once you find some kind of starting point and some kind of sets of systems, you select from a huge number of potential systems and families of forms, and then you work on them and shape them and bring them into some kind of configuration which looks like nothing else you might have seen before, but it is then functionally much more potent than if you had stuffed your functions into a preconceived type, which you inherited from history. Okay? That's not often enough understood. So be quite inventive about this formally, and then you functionalize afterwards. I mean, that's the process. And that could be on large scale. Of course, we have no tools to do that. to expand the repertoire as well and cope with that. So this is we designed every single building of that complex, over 25 buildings. And that's also productivity, huge productivity gains in that. But again, today I'm talking about the formal repertoires. And I mean, that is not only that you have curvature and that you have blending and intersection and you have field conditions where the gradual transformation. These are new kind of characteristics of an architectural, which is partly drawn from, you know, analogies with organisms or inorganic nature or landscapes, etc. Where you draw it from is a good question. And I'll show you later on that contemporary art has something to offer here as well. You know, how do you kind of tie things together and expand a differentiated field and generate unity across that field, like a force field, etc. So there are lots of analogies you can draw on. So how did such an architecture become historically possible? What had happened? Why were we suddenly enlightened and capable of doing something like this when it wasn't possible seemingly for thousands of years? I mean, that's not just reducible to technology, that's formal research. And so what enabled architecture to mutate and innovate to that extent from here to here and beyond? So one answer is the agent of mutation and accelerated evolution is modern art, and in particular abstract modern art, which remained a puzzle for generations. What the hell is modern abstract art about? What nonsense is that? What meaning does it have? Well, the meaning is that it allowed all the design disciplines to kind of see the light of pure, free creation in the abstract, unfettered by mimesis of just repeating old forms, preconceived types, and have this free creation, but then quite quickly realizing what that could be instrumentalized in the next step. But before you have that first step, you cannot do the second step. So modern art is not one of the arts. Arts being, you know, architecture, painting, sculpture. So, I mean, something happened. Why was modern art possible? It's an accident of history, like so many things. Because painting had lost its function. But there were all these painters, and there were all these kind of exhibitions, and all these people buying paintings. So it was running idle, and then it found that idleness became a kind of engine of invention, picked up a new societal function, but unspoken. So this is Walter Benjamin, in his article from 1935, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, talking about historical upheaval, the age where art became reproducible by technological means, led to the alteration of the function of art. But what is that new function of art? Actually, my answer to this is it's only a latent function, and actually a manifest or explicit denial of function. That denial of immediate function allows it to pick up that function of brainstorming chamber and exploratory realm, which for others to instruments later. But first realize, before the 19th century, paintings and sculpture were an integral part of the buildings they were embedded in, and functioned as much by framing and informing everyday life as the buildings themselves. They were part of everyday life. They were also just crafts. They were just utilitarian things. Architects were at the same time painters and sculptors, and vice versa. This too shows that the unity of purpose was, well, to frame social life. So there was not something like modern art or contemporary art simply did not exist whatsoever. And you had what painting and sculpture were nothing, they were a craft. They was indistinguishable from what we now call design. So you have these kind of sculptures and paintings were just ornamenting and decorating and characterizing in a semiological way buildings and spaces. They had the function of social function of making settings for particular events. They weren't kind of free-floating as open-ended mysteries of what is that for, or some kind of provocation, some novelty. No, they were functioning in creating palaces and churches, which were instructing and communicating and characterizing and heightening and giving prestige, etc., to buildings. And so, and you can see with somebody like Michelangelo, and that, so it wasn't different from architecture. It's actually all not even the medieval building troops before architecture arrived. That's another story. Architecture only exists since the Renaissance, by the way. Everything before the Renaissance was kind of vernacular, mere building, tradition-bound building. And architecture, the way we understand it, our first colleagues are, Alberti, Palladio, Serli. We recognize them. They're doing exactly what we're doing. They take a brief, they're inventive, they have an innovative sense, they design completely a new building, and they talk about its innovations, they're writing text about this, and they're simulating the visualizations through perspective. That's only exists since the Renaissance. Everything previously they were just construction companies, no architects. And but the architects were also at the same time the sculptors and the painters. I mean, literally all of them. Alberti was, of course, a painter, and so was Palladio, so was Schinkel, all the way up into the 19th century. Raphael was an architect. You might not know that. I mean, sometimes one of their skills or ways of contributing to the built environment was more prominent than another. Raphael, you know him as a painter, but he was an architect. Michelangelo, maybe most prominently a sculptor. He was an architect and a painter, etc. So, so this is Raphael's. He designed that chapel. Didn't just paint something here. That's a Raphael building. That shows you that these things, this was a continuity. This was all utilitarian things. So, okay, and now there's been these kind of severing off. Art is something totally different. It has nothing to do with immediately. It's not a utilitarian thing at all. And by the way, also engineering separated off. So we need to distinguish quite clearly, because these guys were all engineers as well. Now we have architecture, engineering, and art. These are totally separate realms. I mean, that is what you talk about societal progress. You differentiate and specialize. And they also have specialized discourses, casts of characters, institutions. It's all fully separated out. Even though they collaborate and interfeed, they're different. There's an architectural faculty. You're still in the same building with the engineering faculty, but they're totally different casts of characters and discourses and sensibilities and roles. So it's one of the central historical theses of the theory of architectural autopoiesis, my big book, that this treatment of architecture under the umbrella concept of the arts is long since an anachronism, so it's no longer part of the arts. In the sense of being, or you should actually say, particularly the arts has pulled out. That concept of the arts, which includes art and architecture, is no longer relevant. But anyway, he is talking that you have these coincidence, this kind of operational separation of an architecture means that we don't have these double careers anymore. Like we had always before. There were always these kind of double, triple careers, and now it's unimaginable because it's so different discourse, and you expect different things. So you could say Corbusier, wasn't he a painter? Well, I'm not sure if he's never really recognized as a painter, and for him, and we come to that, some of these paintings became actually formal research within his architecture. So Zaha was a doing all these paintings, you insisted, I'm not a painter, I'm not an artist, I'm an architect. And what I'm doing here when I'm making these kind of drawings and paintings is architectural formal research. So they were kind of a nearly a very, very important emphasis, not to be confused with artists. So modern art is a radically new and unique historical phenomenon. By the way, it only exists in the West. In a lot of other, or let's say Europe, and then the US and the Anglosphere, etc., in any other, I don't think in China they've woken up to that difference in the general population, for sure not. I mean, of course, there's some contemporary art, Chinese artists in the art world through New York, etc., but I don't think in any other culture this has kind of sunk in or exists. But in our world, of course, if you are just kind of doing this kind of vernacular, you need to learn how to draw, correctly or do something, a nice painting, that's just Sunday hobby. That's just kitsch, right? You can't be an artist this way, but in kind of modern culture. So that's also to be, it's radically new. And as I said, it is specifically evolved within kind of modernity, Western modernity, and hasn't arrived in other cultures yet. So the old arts like painting, sculpture, architecture have evolved into mass media, photography, moving making, and the design disciplines like graphic design, product design, and architecture. So what used to be painting is now basically graphic design, photography, well, then animated and film documentary. So the function of painting is this kind of illustration and decoration. This has been all taken over by these kind of, let's say, graphics design in the widest sense. That's the true successor of painting, right? And however, something unprecedented is a new sui generis institution has emerged alongside the new media and design disciplines, modern contemporary art, the art world, the art system, something very particular. With all this kind of global art world circus, gallery circus, famous artists, which are sold for outrageous sums of money, as you know, collector items. It's all a huge mystification. It's an interesting one. It's totally irrational, and we'll come to this, why it actually has a hidden rationality of these kind of bizarre funding mechanisms for this formal research, like crazy, Jeff Koons 50 million for a piece of work. The entire social function of art underwent an upheaval. I mean, I would say painting, sculpture, when the advent of the first truly revolutionary means of reproduction, namely photography. Through that, art felt a crisis. It reacted with the theory of l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake. I mean, this is Walter Benjamin. He's a kind of insightful commentator and philosopher and social philosopher of culture. So the art head really was idle. All these guys were basically out of business. But they had this huge prestige. They had these kind of great places and salons. And all of that was, had no function. So it required a function. I mean, it was a gradual process, of course, where these pieces also kind of set themselves free from particular contexts, and there was an art market evolving, and et cetera, and careers of artists. So art, for its art's sake, l'art pour l'art, it shows that there is no purpose. It becomes explicit. Don't tell me I have any purposes. Don't tell me what to do. I have no responsibilities here. I'm just expressing. There's no mystification. Expressing what? Yourself or the world? And anyway, in the further course of events, the idea of a pure art rejected not only any kind of social function, but also any prompting by an actual subject. So before, of course, art had, a communicative purpose in a particular place. It was, historical painting depicting a certain battle and in the right location, namely in some kind of town hall or palace. So that was also then, it kind of, the withdrawal of any purpose, of any explicit purpose, and the refusal of any purpose and responsibility or any functionality then allowed also that, well, why do you have to depict anything at all? That led to the possibility of abstract art. You can see some kind of strange evolution of something kind of they pulled the rug off under some kind of institutions which had purposes, and now they're running idle and they're looking for funds and looking for life and looking for stories and mystiques, and that's the way it worked. So now my theory of contemporary art, we've gone through that process, and that was the process which took, the Impressionists were starting that, of course, Impressionism, Expressionism. So it started in the 19th century, becomes quite dramatically with abstract art visible and strange and bizarre in the early 20th century. And now it's kind of, we have the art world and we can use it, but not consciously. We can use it indirectly, latently as a society. It's I'm saying something, it's a necessary realm, functional domain, although it cannot say its function, nearly, for any contemporary innovative society. I don't think you can have a flourishing world society and innovative, creative industry kind of society without art, in the sense of contemporary art. If you shut this down and say, oh, that's kind of seems to be kind of wasteful and nonsense, you shut all of it down, I think we are cutting off a very important mechanism of invention, let's say, which is that, let's say, formal research for the design disciplines. So, so contemporary art, the art world, is a social space of, inverted commas, irresponsibly, explicitly irresponsible, freewheeling experimentation or brainstorming. And as you know, in the brainstorming phase of a project, anything goes. Don't hold back. Say anything, wild free association. You don't, it's all about writing everything down, and then you kind of weed through later. So it's, the whole point of it is don't hold back. Random nearly. Free association, just recklessly throw things out there. That's the best way to brainstorm. So contemporary art is akin to this kind of play, inverted commas. And Dadaism, I'm sure, is the first, I think, paradigmatic instantiation where it becomes super clear. But it's just the mutation engines. They invert everything. They make fun of everything. They make bizarre things, as kind of outrageous and crazy and absurd and as possible. And they use automatic writing, and surrealism is like this. Just write something or generate automatic drawing. Random as possible. And that makes sense. I mean, that's the mutation chamber, the brainstorming chamber for the forms. Brainstorming with form is just generate random stuff. The only thing is make it different from what I've ever seen before. Graphic spaces. So art's character of open-ended exploration is safeguarded by the expulsion of explicit purposes. So if you basically the thing you're not allowed in the art world is, oh, I've done this nice thing and it really works well and it's something utilitarian thing. No, what are you doing here? Utilitarian is exactly what is excluded here, right? But anything which is not, which is kind of experimental and open-ended, and then you don't have to place functional criteria on it yet to weed it out. You let this kind of inspire. That's the idea. Therefore, all demands of utility are kind of excluded. The art game is random play seeking out difference, radical novelty. And if you're an art student, that's what you have to learn. Just, everything is surrealist, subversion. There are some people who are coming in and art theorize and giving stories and, oh, this is an expression of this and that. The student. A successful artist never gets into that. They reject all of that. That doesn't give you a chance to become a good artist. If you want to kind of be triggered by these kind of curatorial explanations, they're all for the dustbin, by the way. Rubbish them all. Also for the consumers of art, this is irrelevant. And that means also one thing, contemporary art has only one true audience, creative industry professionals. There's no point in letting the general public or tourists run through a contemporary art exhibition. That's just totally... Anyway, they can't get it. They can do nothing with that. It's only creative industry professionals. Bringing school children to kind of contemporary art exhibition. This is kind of totally oh, we have to be exclusive. That's all rubbish. Okay? Because, who has ever watched... Have you ever watched video art? Is anybody capable of watching 5 hours of video art weekend after weekend? And nobody can do that. It's totally undigestible. But I tell you who's watching it, vividly and avidly, and looking for all the new video art. The only people who do that is filmmaker, movie directors, cinematography professionals, documentary filmmakers. That's the only audience for video art. Okay? And we are the only audience for this kind of spatial, environmental art, sol le vide, etc., etc. It's no, everybody else is just, I don't know what to call it, somebody in the headlights. So, anyway. Art only inspires but never functions in any way. It never really functions as design, as mass media instruction, or as political communication. Also sometimes, political manifestos, this kind of graphic design or the sloganizing, that could be experimented within art. These kind of, but they're not political communications. I mean, you can't take an artist seriously for this politics. He's not a politician. He has no following, no movement, no responsibility, no political agenda, no program. Just play. So it's not only, I'm emphasizing all the design disciplines because that's where we are. We're sitting in architecture, but we think the same discourse applies to all the design disciplines. But there's others. I mean, internet art, remember that? It disappeared. Why? Because we now have a functioning internet. We don't need internet art anymore. Who's going to watch internet art at this point? Well, it's a big thing. You don't know that, but internet art was a big thing in the late 80s and early 90s because you had to experiment. You had to find out what are you going to do with this? What possible these networks and what kind of formats can we have? And, and then, so the resolute rejection of determinate purpose and of being measured against performance criteria often frustrates and angers onlookers who don't get it. If you're not a creative professional, and sometimes you also run around randomly, maybe you're not so conscious of it, but then you get inspired. I mean, and the other thing is, in the art world, so there's these professional artists, these professional agents provocateurs who don't know what they're doing. All they know is, I got to do something crazy, I've got to do something really insane, something really kind of strange, and but use new technology like the internet and use intuitively, totally intuitive. But there's another group of people you can make use of the art world. And that's avant-garde designers, architects. So you actually know that you want to be an architect. So we, Zaha did architects, Zaha said never, he always said, I'm not an artist, but gallerists were interested, museums were interested to show the work, finance the work, and we do some kind of furniture, like they looked at it as sculpture in the art world, and there was a mismatch. They looked at it in some way, we looked at it another way, but we can use all these designers, and some of the major filmmakers, they were video artists first. Why? They didn't have budgets. They didn't have a space. They didn't have, so the art world finances kind of crazy things which nobody with a utilitarian agenda would finance. It's just these public funds or these crazy billionaires who inject millions into crazy experiments. They don't know what they're doing. They only know that this is a name and I might actually it's very irrational. But you can't put rationality to it because if you put rational purposes to the art project, you kill it. That's the end of the art project, by necessity. Then you already measured against some purpose and you fail. Shut down. So that's the crazy thing that has to be crazy to work. So the whole point of the art world is to offer a space where potentials and possible purposes of new technologies can be explored without performance pressures that would shut down the experiment once you try to nail them. So it is really not nailing them, and it's really not knowing. And the same actually when you work in an innovative and avant-garde way, when you do drawings, Zaha used to sit there doing sketch after sketch after sketch, not knowing for which projects these were the sketches. That was the whole point. To then later on others, when you have a project, to look through thousands of sketches and try to make the match. because you can infer the form from the function, but you can kind of find a matching form. Anyway, so that is the thing. So arts and crafts, so painting, sculptures, architecture, they were actually, to some extent, more or less just crafts. The arts and crafts, everything which was sculpture, they became the design disciplines and media disciplines. And the art world kind of branched off, radically new phenomenon. But the art world is used without it understanding it fully by all the creative design professionals and other creative industry professionals. That's this kind of back and forth. Okay. Now, this is what it looks like. So, have you, if you imagine a Le Corbusier or Ut or Duisburg or Rietfeld building appearing in the 1920s in a neighborhood, that's crazy stuff. This is like a spaceship from nowhere. How was it possible? Through that. Through this kind of bizarre kind of abstraction of art running idle, becoming a game of putting something on canvas which is unseen, novel, and different, and has maybe certain rules and logics. And then that gets translated back into design. So you couldn't have arrived at this kind of architecture without modern abstract art. I mean, Mondrian and also, Malevich, who Zaha was very much inspired on. And there was an excess. The 20s and 10s, they brought an excess of forms which modernism for 50 years picked up some stuff. There was a huge reservoir of unpicked up stuff, which then kind of deconstructivism and Zaha and picked up much later. But the Mondrian was a mystic. He was a totally intuitive character. He was weird and off the charts, anti-intellectual. And then you have someone like Duisburg, who is a strategist and also a painter, and he said, we can do something with this. And if you look at the Bauhaus, when Gropius opened it, he had these kind of characters. He had the Kandinsky, in Itten. I mean, these guys were, Schlemmer. They were these artists who were crazy. I mean, literally, they were in monks' coats. They looked bizarre. They were talking nonsense. I mean, but they generated stuff. And then you have these kind of more intellectual figures, serious figures who understand industrialization, and they use the same in constructivism. You have that kind of bizarre mixture. And interestingly, it was very fast that the Bauhaus started in 1919-20. They had these artists there, and by the second half of the 20s, and then Hannes Meyer came in, basically they had done their job. They were all eliminated, basically. And now you have serious industrial design, urbanism on large scale, modernist architecture, etc. But I will emphasize on this. So this is not necessarily, you don't have to, it's like internet art disappeared. There's not much point anymore. Once it is underway, so much, you had the radical new sensibility, spatiality, this kind of space which is infinite, open, flowing, lines until infinity, asymmetry, ponderated composition, and you can run with that. And this wonderful, this is also coming out of this style. These compositions, they're dramatic, they're radical. There's, all architecture for thousands of years was one thing. Closed volumes, subdivided with volumes within closed volumes. That's it. Look at this. Totally free and open, very ambiguous, whereas one space begins where another begins. And that's coming out of these kind of Mondrian sketches, etc. And the Barcelona Pavilion shows that. These planes pass each other by, and nothing is closed. You can read spaces, find spaces where you like them. And they were also, of course, trying to do that kind of three-dimensionally, etc. And I think in terms of the consciousness, clear consciousness of this theory of art emerges after the revolution in the Soviet Union with people like Elisitsky or some who is both operates on the level of creating formal structures is a totally different intellectual level than something like Malevich, who's a mystic. These guys are mystics, and they have to be mystics to generate. Maybe Lisinski couldn't have originated this, but then he can run with it. Formal structures into architectural structures into it. This is a beautiful, the Lisinski Browns, and there's not only the composition of intersecting ensembles, there's also overlapping zones, open structures, and then you have a Leonidev translating that Brown into an architecture, and the Lisinski, the swarm formations, directionality. And we, by the way, of course, we were inspired with. We were very familiar with this work of the Russian avant-garde. We installed it in the Guggenheim in the early 90s as exhibition designers. Later on, we came back to the Guggenheim and showed our works in there just on the side. So we have these kind of tectons from somebody like Malevich, where he's controlled it, brought it back to some kind of orthogonality to make it more fit into an architectural paradigm. So, okay, rational control is the standard. Only what counts is novelty. The meaning of the works of art is only discovered in retrospect. So in retrospect, you can now say what was the meaning of a Mondrian, if it had a meaning. It had a kind of retrospective redemption of this otherwise meaningless exercise into actually allowing a whole paradigm of modern space to emerge. And we all can run with this and create things we couldn't have done otherwise. So it's art is society's brainstorming chamber. And then it delivers to all these, through an avant-garde, this shuttles between these, but also the avant-garde kind of go back in. And I have quite a few colleagues and ex-students who try to do something quite original. They're architects or designers. They end up in the art world because they can't yet make it, and they might spend their career in the art world, but what they really want to be is designers. For instance, something which we've been thinking a lot about is, you've seen all these interactive art installations where you can come in and you have sensors and actuators and something is happening and you're trying to figure out what it is. I mean, we have that. We've been looking at these things for 30 years. What's the point of all of that? Is it a gimmick? No, it's art. What does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. We need these experiments, and somebody needs to finance them, and somebody needs to be kind of cajoled to pay, 500,000 for such meaningless structure. Well, the whole point is to learn, to understand, to develop technologies and start to see what can we do with it. The point is this: we need to have responsive, interactive environments in fulfilling real human purposes, and we are designing those, but it's tough to really do them. But the actuators and sensors and so on. So that's the point of all this interaction art. Of course, they don't know that, because if you would say it, then you could say, well, what's the purpose? The whole point is they don't know. And it's hard. All they can do is run these dry runs, play with these technologies. And that's hard enough. Don't put a pistol on their chest and say, and what does it do for me? They have no answer. They don't demand an answer, because to demand an answer, you shut this down. So you will never reach any interactive architectural installation. Real, living, breathing, interactive architecture cannot be created without interactive art form. That might take a long time. Now, this is why I wanted to say I was talking about the Bauhaus. I mean, look at these characters. You can see who is the architects and who is the artists. And who designed industrial designer? Of course, these two characters. I mean, but this was an essential necessity for this hyper-rational modern architecture, because you cannot deduct and then rationally come up with modern architecture. So dramatically different than anything you've seen before. There's no analytic route to that. So you need these characters, these mutation machines. And the best mutation machine is one which doesn't understand a thing, or has mystifications, a totally misconception of themselves. This is these characters. This is the Dada guys. You can see they're playing with their faces, with their aesthetics, these are the true breakthrough artists. And of course, you cannot trust them with a purposeful project. But you can't achieve rational innovation without these characters. So you have to think, where are you on the spectrum? I invite you to, I don't know, with some feedback. I invite you to reflect. It's still like this. I know you don't know. I mean, actually, was a friend. We had a shared friend. On the far right, what's his name? Damien Hirst, Foster, and then the avant-garde architect is somewhere in between. Shit, what's going on? Up. Maybe it's. So, the interesting thing is the social roles of artist versus architect have been thoroughly differentiated by now. I mean, these kind of artists didn't exist in the history of the world. And as I said, to this day, they don't exist in India and China except as a Western import. But we can see the difference, and but also this thing comes through. We can aesthetically navigate, and we can immediately see where you have the art. That's very important. We can see cast of characters on their demeanor, on their dress, on their way of how they speak and what they do, and so on and so forth. So there's a kind of sociology underlying that. I mean, that shows how different these roles are. But the avant-garde character shuttles in between, and it's interesting that, yeah, I mean, Foster has to deal with big finance, so he's wearing a tie. And we not necessarily. And when I come to I never wear a tie. So architects get away with that. But basically, it's quite interesting. The industrial designers, they look much more cool. They're more similar to the artists. Why is that? Because projects are not as kind of heavy and as anyway, so that's all architects look like this, by the way. Not you yet. I mean, you will socialize into that. And so look at the stuff, Zaha stuff. This was, basically she said the unfinished project of modernity. She meant the kind of all the stuff which the modernists didn't take from the 20s. It was then now time, because higher level of complexities in the city, overlaying different new into old, more mixed use conditions. There's lots of good reasons for expanding the repertoire, of not using the same kind of, it was super free and open, relatively speaking. Modernism took everything else what went before. But it also was quite restrictive once you see this stuff. All sorts of angles, intersection things. So we needed a repertoire expansion because we shifted out of that era of, let's say, in your terms here, socialism into kind of dry, dynamic capitalist society. I mean, this actually was fueled by the microelectronic revolution and computational revolution ultimately. That's why communism collapsed. And you had a new kind of market dynamism society to make the fullest utilization of this, moving back into the city centers, away from that suburban segregation, 9 to 5, dynamic, lifelong learning, self-organizing companies and network organizations, and fusing between learning, university, and startup companies. All this kind of dynamism needs a different morphology, a different built environment, and that's what started here. These kind of complexity. You can see this idea of intersecting things, so thinking overlapping, and the overlap is a new condition, belongs to 3 different places at the same time, simultaneity. You may be part of 2 different or 3 different teams, or you have multiple social roles. The modern world is much more, it's a post-70s, 80s, 90s, much more complex. We need a more complex architecture to represent that, and we can't use that repertoire of the modernists. They got rid of proportionate and symmetry and proportionality, and had asymmetry and all sorts of proportion and endlessly long buildings and tall and bringing things together, but still seriality, orthogonality. And this was that wouldn't have been enough anymore. So there is reasons, functional reasons, why we have to shift gear and expand the repertoire. We have new issues to solve. This kind of layering of complex interacting spaces. So that was this kind of jumble of things coming together, complexity, differentiation, not just endless repetition, and neatly ordering the different departments and different parts, never connecting. You don't have to communicate only through a central command, super simple. No, society is very different. So, self-directedness of different units that don't listen to somebody on top. There's no hierarchy necessarily. That is expressed in here. And it started in the 80s, and it continues through the 90s, and we're delivering it in the last 25 years. So, but where did she get this from? I mean, she doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of, Malevich, Lisitsky, etc., stuff which the modernists had no use for. But it's also that because they didn't have use for it because they needed it. It didn't make sense. Couldn't be functionalized. Now it can be functionalized. And of course, then once you realize, then we went further with the repertoire expansion, landscape for motion and so on. So, and then she did start doing her own kind of formal research. Where's my phone? What time is it? I don't know if I should. Huh? When should I shift it to discussion? Now or in 10 minutes? Okay. So, I mean, this is like, the evolution. How do all these new creatures evolve? Of course, there was no design. This is all random sifting, proliferation of stuff, and then trying to do something, fitting together. So this kind of variation, selection, reproduction, this is similar in design. A lot of these things, nobody came up with modern art for a purpose. Stuff was there, and then there was use cases, and somebody grabbed onto this. It's like you go into your workshop, and you have to do something, and there's kind of random stuff from previous shit, and you just bricolage that stuff. But the stuff had to be there, and then you locked in with that stuff. So, but if somebody throws a whole shitload of new stuff into your workshop, wow, now you can do a few more things. That's the way society also evolves. And, you have variation, mutation, that's it, and selection. Selection, you have to have that alertness. You have to have a problem to solve. What am I going to use? Okay, great, I use this, etc. And seeing something as something else. That's what you in the game. But you have a problem to solve. But you can generate that stuff for the moves you could make when you later have to draw something which makes sense. Where do you get these from? They need to be expanded. We need these characters who are expanding the repertoire. And some of them are aggressively formalist in a sense, like Peter Eisenman, Jeff Kipnis. There are some characters who say, I don't want to hear anything about function. Architecture has nothing to do with function. Don't come in with function. I don't want to hear about it. It's nonsense. Architecture should be like pure music. It's just a kind of proliferation of composition for the composition's sake. This La Polar thing, they put that stance into architecture. It doesn't make sense generalizing it in architecture. But as casts of character, they've been very productive because they've been extremely innovative. Precisely because they're refusing, they don't understand really the final purposes, which we really have to deliver to. But in the division of labor, you can have such characters. And they can exist within architecture to some extent as a kind of avant-garde formal researcher. So I'm always defend the formal research, but it's false when I say, yeah, that's the end all of it. Never do anything else. Well, that's absurd. We just generate this stuff, and nobody's using it. It's just all for the garbage. It's just for our own kind of thrill. Why is it thrilling? So, but sometimes there is this kind of necessary misconception of one's own thing. You know, this, where you can't make the function latent, because if, manifest. It must be latent, because if you speak it out, you kill it. So we need to recognize these severe limitations to our imagination. Our imagination, we can imagine what we've seen. So how do you innovate if you can't get away from what we know, what we've seen, if all we can imagine is that with a slight little bit of combination? No, so it means you have to deliberately give yourself up, surrendering to an alien force, refusing the familiar, forcing the novel. And that could be generative algorithms, that could be automatic writing, or Eisenman just doing formal moves, and they were interesting. Grids which would start to migrate, which will overlap and intersect, subtraction, addition, layering, and they just became complex. I mean, that made sense, and there's an intuitive kind of connection between this and the kind of layered city like Tokyo, the chaos of Tokyo. So there's no way to infer the form from the function. That's the naivety of that form follows function statement. You can't do it. You can do it in very, very prescribed narrow limits, where you already know roughly where the ingredients, you don't have to reach out for other ingredients. You know the ingredients, and then you just, it's a bit of shuffling them around so that they're slightly more optimal, given that you only have these 3 rooms to kind of put in their boxes. Well, there's a whole universe of potential solutions you don't see. We're not in that little game of optimization. The game of optimization is prescribed by how you set it up to begin with. And that's the point we're talking about here. And to get outside of that, but even in that shifting, how do you do it? Generate and test. You need an analytic measure. You generate and test, and get outside again. So generate and test is the only intelligent. Which is the generate bit is random, and then you test it. You try it, trial and error, basically. That's the only creative process. But you can do one thing. You can stand back and, let's say, set up the stuff you're going to use to play with. You try to expand that. You have what I call heuristic constraints, and you avoid some. You have heuristics. Just to say this, you have also dogmas where you say, I'm using these I'm only working with curves. I refuse to work with straight lines. That's quite healthy sometimes to force it into something new. You can later compare it with both straight and only straight and so on. But sometimes for the avant-garde, you need to also, to force into a new space, you just stop doing things you have been doing before. I mean, we have, and I think that for good reason, it's another lecture. We never use circles, triangles, squares as these pristine, hermetic, self-sufficient, stable forms. We never touch them. But even Le Corbusier is saying that's all there ever is to architecture. The composition of circles, cubes and squares, and pyramids for roofs, because that fits modern architecture, that fits classical architecture, that fits all architecture. That was this. You know, architecture is the pristine kind of play in the light of these pristine kind of basic geometric primitives. And I'm saying, when we founded DL and with Zaha, we said, we're never going to use them. We're refusing all prior architectural repertoires are taboo in our work. For instance, yeah. So we need these taboos as well to push. Anyway, should we start the discussion? Okay.
Maybe everybody expected to speak about project, but to be particularly, because it is a part of our course, we want some kind of theoretical position and connection with practice, with education, etc. I have so many questions.
Wait, I'll just get my phone. Yeah,
okay.
Just to check time.
But maybe we are discussing a lot, but first maybe students want something to say.
No, it's great. We have half an hour, and I won't leave. I won't let you go before you push your questions on me.
So, any questions?
We wait.
Yes.
We won't.
Before,
Nobody leaves before the questions come flying in.
Before lecture, we discussed actually about the beauty.
Oh yeah, I
And it is
didn't. Yeah,
very,
yeah.
Yes, strange topic for the students and for academia. So maybe I can ask you, Patrick,
Okay.
about the beauty of Zaha Hadid drawings, because it is a huge topic. Maybe it is a woman principle. Yes. There, okay. I'm as a practicing architect. Always discuss with my colleagues and partners. Is there any specific relation between design, considering women and men?
No,
What do you
that's
think?
rubbish. That's rubbish.
Yes. Yes, but it is a huge topic.
Wait, I just want to come to this week. Zaha's participated in that mutation. She made some outlandish moves, right, to expand the repertoire. They seem to be incredibly irrational, but once you've done them, you know you're in a different place. But then you also know, okay, now you have a project and you have to win this and do something high performance. But you're going to do it with this other means. So she had these drawings. She's like, what can we do with that? I mean, actually, we did great projects for that. There's some advantages to this, the freedom between them, but they all kind of belong together, and they're diverse, and they have a kind of thrust. And we did this, then this kind of thing, calligraphy. The curve before Zaha, even me, somebody like Oscar Niemeyer, they did curves, and they had a bit of degree of seemingly freeform, but they were only straights and arcs. That's it. And this is kind of continuously changing radius, pulsing, like a whiplash. But they have logic and law and integralness, and then these fades. Fading? Transitions, smooth transitions, not kind of up to here is this room, then something else. No, gradual transformations. So these are dramatic moves in terms of the graphic, so these kind of lines, and then she started to distort things. So it was, again, perspective, vanishing points, isometric, skewing things. That's what you would do. You presume the building to be orthogonal, and then you skew things so that it looks three-dimensional. No, she wanted to skew the actual things in all sorts of ways. And it seems these are all kind of surrealist moves nearly. But once you do this, you have a new potential. You can lay these out and then you skew them all or vanishing point them all. And then they deliver their relational, the topology is the same, but you can get some kind of focal point. You get kind of from small to large, you get something. So these were several outrages, or just saying architecture was always different from landscape. Make architecture like landscape, pulsing, gradients, forest petering out, rivers flowing against the bedrock and carving it and what have you. This kind of, so these were breakthrough moves through analogy, through just, but you can we win a lot of competitions with this because we have more potential and we have all these options. So that is, for instance, beauty. I will come to the theory of beauty, and then look at these kind of fields, swarms, flock of birds, school of fish. Make a whole swarm of buildings, so you can make them different scale, different size. But then there's an order. There's an order which isn't, A, B, C, D. It's an order of kind of direction, pulling in, pulling out. So there's much more versatility of articulation. And so, okay, here, this is, you can read it. This is my theory of beauty, and then we can kind of think how we appraise Zaha's beauty. So aesthetic values or sensibilities are evaluative conditioned reflexes. What aesthetics means, beauty means you're attracted to something. Quite intuitively. You don't know why you like it, but you do. You want to be close to it. You want to, it's quite visceral, potentially. And it's intuitive, and immediately you know that. And you also know what you stay away with. And it's very, very basic. Every organism has that. Something smells rotten, don't eat it. Don't come close. You know, something smells delicious, why don't you go closer? Attraction, repulsion, so on that level, but it, of course, is much more refined and now, this represents, and so we have these aesthetic sensibilities. You see a person, you like him, or you see a building, an environment, you're attracted to it. Why? Maybe you don't know. You've somehow learned to, you understand somehow that might be interesting, might be good. There's something you look for, something correlate with this look and feel of this space. And that's why you go there. Something, there's a purpose you pursue, but you can't analytically analyze them. It's something you've learned. We do that all the time. We have to navigate the world aesthetically. So it represents condensed experience and therefore shortcuts or substitutes analysis. There's a kind of instant intuitive evaluation of responses that identify the functional and beneficial on the basis of correlated superficial features accessible to immediate perception. So we are all inevitably navigating our physical and social environments aesthetically. And the problem is this, and this is why all as designers, which drawings are you attracted to? What are you going to use? When you draw, you keep drawing and doodling around and trying this and trying that, and what do you like? Why you select? It's aesthetic. There's some kind of recognition of what might work. It's compositional coherence, a certain poise and tension you're looking for, certain expression. You keep looking, you're seeing the buildings, the parts of the buildings. Maybe they're too separate here, they don't belong together. Here I can't identify them now. So there's something intuitively which you look for, and that is, as a designer, as out in the world, we continuously need this. But the problem is if you have outmoded old sensibilities, where you're nostalgic and you only like these kind of nice historical places, and therefore you can't stand a large building and you crowd, and then you hamper yourself, you're dysfunctional, you have wrong sensibilities, you keep running after the wrong girls, they're not good for you, they're not kind of contemporary, they don't, or the other way around, you keep running after this kind of dysfunctional macho guys because you have the wrong, sensibilities, aesthetic, or when it's also moral sensibilities. What behaviors do you like actually and find sophisticated and attractive? What is attraction and repulsion? We need to continuously relearn that, and we need aesthetic revolutions and innovations also in the design repertoire. So you should learn to love that which delivers the better solutions. They have a look and feel. These morphologies better to work with. You should first of all like them, and then also know how to select within the variations. That's my theory of beauty, and we need it as an absolute necessary category because we can't live without it. If you deny it, like often, this is not. Then finish.
Totally different.
Yeah.
Question. Parametrism is still a huge methodological tool for production, let's say, beauty. How do you explain potential of parametrism? In education, first of all, and then in practice. How do you use that method with your students and in Zaha office? Okay, so first, parametricism. The first thing I want to note is that if you look at our work and you saw the first 50 slides or 100 slides, the versatility and variation and within that paradigm, the variety you get in there is bigger than all previous styles put together. Hugely larger. So that search space, but at the same time, interestingly, you can recognize it. You can see what belongs to it and what doesn't. So it's also very good for aesthetic later on. When you encounter an environment, you should be attracted to it. You can't guarantee that it is all done extremely well and purposefully, etc. But you know one thing, there's a chance that it is way superior to anything else which is just boxes within boxes. Because the potential is much more subtle to integrate complex interior relationships, exterior relationships, to have more legibility in the face of complexity, more complexity made legible, and more integration, more visibility, inter-awareness, these open atrium conditions, etc., etc., etc. You know that in a minimalist project, you can never compete. If a minimalist comes in and wants to compete with us, is if you can kind of
he's only one pen and you can only move this way and this way and this way. And now he has to build something very subtle, but he only has these 5 moves and not like this. How could they ever compete? Doesn't mean that somebody's doing all of this and creates nonsense. So I can't exclude that. But I know one thing, the best work must by necessity be within the realm of parametricism. And now this has moved on to tectonism, integrating so many of the subtle, sophisticated optimization tools of structural optimization, material fabrication optimization, environmental engineering, and passive system optimization, that's the latest stage. And minimalism is incapable of absorbing any of this whatsoever. So I can say this with full confidence, and again, there could be versions which are somebody's pretending, and you can't, it's faking it, as it were, that this is just making the full tools and delivering to the fullest potentials and also the fullest requirements of a contemporary, let's say, large mixed-use complex or very dense super synergy delivering, let's say, knowledge economy urban center. These are the tasks. The bigger the task, the more complex, the more it will show off that we leave the old repertoires behind. They have no chance. Yeah, next. And there are, by the way, also aesthetic heuristics where you can characterize the features you should seek out and the features you should leave behind and avoid.
Yes,
Yeah.
I have a question. What do you think the architecture in the future will look like? Because I think that architecture is kind of a response of the social happenings. And in this time, in all countries in Europe and across the globe, there are some riots and protests. And I think that the power is getting to the civil part of the nation again. So how do you think that the architecture will respond to that? Will it come to...
Well, I have an answer to that. I mean, unfortunately in Europe, architecture, I wrote the article in the Korean magazine, The End of Architecture, because architecture has ceased to exist within the advanced Western countries, basically. Why? Through political clampdown. And I mean, I can see it in London. It's basically the urban development process is so collectivized and politicized. Basically, it's paralyzed, and with very few exceptions, that very, very little is happening. You know, if you have community engagement, means don't do it, prohibit, stop, prevent, NIMBYism, but also whatever can be done. There's no degrees of freedom at all. Not even for developers, with regard to the product mix, the land use, nor with the architects and translating that. Everything is 100% prescribed by planning bureaucrats, planning bureaus, with land use plans, and they prescribe everything, the density, the functional allocations, the quantities, the number of 4-bedroom, if it's a residential, 3-bedroom, 2-bedroom, every single room is prescribed, every piece of equipment is prescribed, and then they prescribe the facade, it needs to be brick, the windows very small, and also politically it should be as inconspicuous as possible because you might upset somebody, somebody will notice the building. So basically the end of architecture is there. Why? Because it collapses back to the vernacular. Before we had architects, tradition-bound building, architecture can only be generated by professional architects who are embedded in a discourse, a rational, critical discourse which compares across options and opportunities and repertoires and sifts out in a lively, critical discourse the best solutions. And that can only be an expert discourse. It can't be done by politicians. If you allow clients to determine your building, it can no longer be architecture. Because they just cut off. They have their own fancy, their own kind of myopa. They're not exposed to the criticism of the discipline, which is a global discipline with millions of people participating. You throw something on Design, on YouTube, or on Facebook, you get thousands of people kind of responding, seeing it, integrating it into their design. Everybody of you can throw something out there, inspiring, and the next day, all design across the world will be influenced and will be different, will be one step ahead. Now, the current development process is absolutely blind to this. It's the end of architecture, full stop, unfortunately in Europe. But I know how it would flourish. You have to kind of throw out all of that and deliver freedom. Freedom also for a society when they want to converge all the institutions, the entrepreneurs, the businesses, the whatever needs to use land. They should be totally free and compete and sift out and forge these synergy clusters where things come together who want to be together. Not some bureaucrat put some colors on a map and that stays like this for 50 years. No, continuously optimizing through individual freedom decisions and through market process. Market process are process of freedom of individual choices. That's what we need, and we have that very few parts of the world in some kind of spaces like Gurgaon, a city outside of India, or actually in London there's a city of London, the square mile, the financial sector, which is incredibly dynamic, incredibly high value, incredibly potent. And that's where you have a bizarre accident of history. You have a frozen medieval constitution of the freemans of the city of London. Basically, they have associations, and it's basically the businesses who decide. And they have a much more liberal, free kind of regime. I'm also a freeman of the city of London. And they have been kind of somehow, because avoided this kind of process which affected the rest of the UK, where you had this post-war takeover and basically nationalization of all planning rights, and the discretionary system where you have to kind of brown-nose the planners and councillors and rent seek and negotiate, and it takes everything forever, and you still don't know if it's going to be approved. I mean, we are in that. We have in one project in London, in 10 years, I mean, we would have built it 3 times in other parts of the world. Anyway, so that's the answer. We need to, it's maybe not what you expected, but you need freedom. But the freedom is not do whatever I like. The freedom is you're free to do, but you get ruthlessly criticized by your colleagues. We are supposed to be in charge collectively. We should have, and some glimpses we had, universal and exclusive competency with respect to everything in the phenomenal world. I mean, to some extent it's still there, unless we're so kind of constrained. Everything you see around was designed by a colleague and should be designed of a colleague, but except they're handcuffed.
The other question.
Okay, sorry, it was a bit long.
So, I mean, my question is kind of optimistic in a sense that things were not this way. What I found most interesting here was this process of the functionalization of art to become design. So what I'm interested in, I mean, in your opinion, because I would have to think about it, what do you think is a current art phenomena which has the potential of functionalization for future architecture?
Yeah, I have this. I have something. I should show you a few things on this one. Let's see if it comes up. I mean, this is the old stuff, but the current. There are some artists, this kind of work initially is just La Polar nearly, but these avant-garde architects, but I will come to hopefully, wait. Here. So let's say these are some inverted commas. They're colleagues actually, but they're so innovative, computational design, algorithmic design and fabrication and so on. They to their own kind of slight unhappiness, they only have a career in art. So this Mark Franz, a student of mine, he used to work for us, he only gets art projects. But this is the kind of art which feeds into architecture. he would love to scale up and do actual buildings. So but then there's this guy who is actually an artist. He's a founder of processing, the programming language processing, all these kind of dynamic. He sees himself as an artist, and how is he financing his work? Open source programming. He's an artist, inverted commas. So he's doing these wonderful algorithms, and then he's kind of printing them large scale and selling them for an arm and a leg. So these are the artists who are actually coming out of our world. In this case, all computer science, open source, and guys like this who is actually coming out of art. But there is contemporary art, which fits that agenda which I'm talking about. But to be sure, of course, when you unleash this kind of world of freedom of art, this recklessly irresponsible playing around with shit, of course 95% is not going to end up being used. But 5% is, and that 5% means the world, because if you had 0, then we would still be in the 19th century.
I have one question connected to artificial intelligence and technology of production of architecture. What do you think about it?
It's amazing. It's very productive. So one is a productivity thing, but it's also a creativity engine. And some of the things you can do, of course, it works with the corpus which is there, but you can do new things with it. For instance, this kind of strange hybridization thing, where you, and this is another artist who works with oil spills and patterns and physical. And these guys. So this is a guy working with AI creatively before all these DALL-E 2 and Midjourney and so on. They were developing their own models. They weren't as smooth, they weren't as effective, but they did these kind of so-called GANs and so on. And that he did kind of AI Himmelblau and did these kind of interesting versions of a Gaudi tectonic over a freeform. So you can use it, and you can do stuff like this, which is an engine of invention. So it's a creativity booster. I'm very much, and there's also, of course, there's an enormous amount of AI art, which is trying to say we are this kind of pure art, and then there's, of course, an enormous amount of AI instrumentalization. So, but AI is definitely is another of these technologies we can play with them. We're investing heavily. We have a whole research team looking at all the new stuff and developing and training up models and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, so there's also division of labor. I mean, we are focusing now. We have all we're doing research. 20% of our people are working in research, various types, but it's relatively strategically aimed research. It's not early pioneer, huge risk. 95% of what we're doing is going to be wasted. We're not into that space. That's for you guys too.
I have a question. What do you think, how will AI change the future of parametric design and generally the idea about the authorship in architecture? And is architecture nowadays moving away from public buildings like museums and libraries and going towards closed corporate infrastructures, and especially because of the massive use of AI and the massive productions of big data centers?
No. I think public institutions, places, urban spaces, indoor, outdoor, very important. They're an absolute necessity for kind of vibrant contemporary society, creative industry society. I mean, let's say innovative society, because society now is a knowledge economy and creative innovation industry society where everybody literally is set free to work on research and development of some kind or another and project-based innovative work. And the technologies we have now, they have an infinite capacity to absorb innovations, which is very different from the, let's say, 1950s, where you have assembly line production, mechanical master production, you could, there's more point in inventing 25 new models of this or that, because you can't make them. You can only make millions of the same thing. And the total number of things of maybe in the whole economy is 15 things, and you do them for a decade. Now you can reprogram the robots, 3D print, you can upload, you can iterate the software and the new version every day, every hour, and upload it to billions of people. So there's an infinite amount. It pays to innovate. Any innovation you can let the absorption capacity is infinite for innovation. So you should all work on innovations, and that's what we do. And if you look at the factory from 50 years ago, you had the kind of lined up people, kind of working away 9 to 5, live in a suburb, they don't communicate, they were told what to do, from 20 to 65. Now, all these factories are empty. In China, they have so-called black factories. There's not a single person there. You don't need to switch on the light because there's nobody in them. Everything happens in the research development, in innovation science, agriculture. How many people do you need still? 1% maximum. It used to be kind of 90% of people. And how do we make agriculture more productive? In the major cities, research development, agroscience, that's where the future is. And we need public spaces because you need also for the scientists, you need to conferences, you need to interact, you need to tie in not only the R&D, the marketing, the finance, the research, the deep science, the applied science. You need to communicate. You need to kind of continuously. Sometimes you need to sit down and concentrate. But the higher up in the hierarchy, you only meeting, communicating with across the world, at home, everywhere, flying, internet, the metaverse, and AI feeds into this. It helps us, doing less drudgery. Having a quick idea and letting ChatGPT do it. I mean, I went back to programming now. It's wonderful. You just so you can do it, and that will release us for doing more kind of communication and strategic thinking. And that's why we need much more communication spaces. Now, whether they're public or private, I mean, for me, the public realm should actually is privately delivered is actually very good, because we were talking earlier, state university, private universities, or you have a lot of the public spaces, the pedestrian dense public spaces in London, they're privately owned. But you don't care. Everybody can go move in and out, and they're better maintained, and they have more activation. Because there's incentives to make the most of them. They have markets, they have this and that. So public space for me should be privately run and ordered, and pressure to continuously and upgrade it. And I think there will be more and more public space, but it's not necessarily publicly government owned. For me, public space is a space where you freely go in and out, and it's open, and it's like bars and clubs. Public shopping malls, it's not like so that's we need more and more and ever more, and they also migrate into buildings, into the top, in many levels of the floors. You should have public spaces all over the place. I mean, we in our building, half of the places in our office are not publics in that sense. Free roaming, socializing, unscripted, rescripted. That's the world of the future. But
one more question.
Can you talk about the topic of informations and knowledge, the difference between informations and knowledge? Because lately I heard a sentence that today we live in a world of a lot of information and not a lot of knowledge. And how does the social media, for example, influence that? Like, we have a lot of stuff coming to us, and we don't actually know deeply a lot about that. So.
Yes, and that's why we need we need filters, we need recommendation systems, we need whatever. We actually need self-organizing of these offerings, which think and know they belong together and address a similar audience in the metaverse. I'm a huge fan of the metaverse, and we're building one. A lot of what we're now happening in the cities will happening in the metaverse, but also most of what's happening in the internet will shift from these text-based, leave a trace, come back later, achieve anybody say, into real-time online metaverse communication. So, okay, and different between information and knowledge. Knowledge is maybe when you do something with information, knowing how to, not only knowing that, Knowing that for what? You learn something by heart? Good for you. No, knowing that, how you instrumentalize it, how you create things, how you advance life, how you make a flourishing contribution where you kind of make people happy and yourself happy, and how you advance society and the world. That's knowledge. And for that that's a critical discourse. For me, it's extremely important that we have freedom of speech and freedom of discourse, and we need to use all the means and facilities to find relative communications. And that, again, that needs to be totally privately organized. Through networks and technology is super helpful. All the kind of recommendations and the network of, podcasts and debates and how one leads to the other. That's, it's tough. Of course, you have all this fake news flying around too. So
I think we have
yes.
5 minutes.
Okay.
More questions.
Okay.
I have one question. If you can give us one advice that should lead us to our architectural journey, what would it be?
Read my stuff. Watch my videos. No, we say. Learn skills, relevant skills, and try to understand the problem is this. There's a lot of confusion. The end of architecture is not only talking about all this kind of political paralysis of the university systems and the biennales and discourses, but also the kind of academic discourse got affected by this as well. And so you have all these elite universities. You can't, I feel, we can't hire from there. We can't, they want to talk about, I don't know, some favelas or outskirts. We won't have jobs there, and they don't need us to do their plumbing. They know they just need some money to have the plumbing done.
Marco.
You mentioned earlier that Zaha used to do a lot of sketches and paintings as a means of formal and
Research.
architectural research. Yeah, and I'm interested right now through your practice, how much of that still informs your methodology, or do you still have some kind of paradigm of concepts you want to try, and also how much does your current research is informed or project maybe by context? I know this is very much, but this differentiation between context and your concepts which you developed, and how much does it?
Well, I think there's an important question, and I have to tell you, yes, we still browse, we use AI, we use, when we start a project, we have several teams or people, many people in parallel, trying quite different things. And I also kind of look at this, try that, However, I have to say that there's also something which is what I call historical cycles of innovation. So the urgency, let's say the crisis of where a paradigm has broken down and you have to kind of desperately brainstorm to find a hook, a way forward. That comes around when there's really a transformation in societal arrangements, often also driven by technology. And that's not always with the same urgency. So you have these cycles of innovation. So for instance, and these kind of revolutionary periods versus more cumulative periods. So, and I have a whole lecture on that, my so-called epochal styles. The revolution of, when the Renaissance happened, is actually the beginning of architecture itself. Why? Capitalism started to emerge out of feudalism. Dramatic transformation. So architecture had to respond to that. And then when it moves on to the Baroque, you have actually, capitalism was no longer small city-states, the northern Italian city-states. So they were actually larger, integrated national economies, like the Community of France, where you need larger institutions and you get more mercantilist planning involved. You need Baroque to create a super large complex like Versailles or the Vatican, St. Peter's. You can't do that with Renaissance. You can't. Scale is wrong, the distance viewing, there's a number of reasons. Then you have the next one. We have actually the French Revolution and the glorious British Revolution. You have actually capitalism full on. Laissez-faire capitalism coming on, and that brings on a totally new throws out all, the Baroque was dead. Rococo was ripped up. And you have kind of eclecticism, historicism. And then you have this huge thing of the Industrial Revolution finally coming to full flourish and moving into the consumer production world. And you had the socialist revolutions or the working class. And the modernism is a massive transformation. And that's where, so it's not, and that's where you had all these characters at the Bauhaus, basically, where they did this stuff. You don't need it, but then there's also, let's say the brainstorming session is there to kind of then select, work through, and run with. You can't, it's not like continuously nothing but brainstorming. You know what I mean? So in this us as well, the next big thing was basically what I call Fordism to post-Fordism. You have the computational microelectronic revolution and telecommunication revolution and the internet revolution, which brought on basically parametrism, tectonism, first was deconstructivism into that. So that's when you need this kind of fundamental formal research where you have to tear up everything you've known and start from scratch and wildly browse. That is not coming around every decade. So that was around in the 80s, into the 90s, and that's not on to us now. So if you think, and you're so inspired by the stuff, that you're going to go become that crazy artist, might not work out. It's not going to be helpful.
Okay,
only to some extent.
And for the end.
Yeah.
Yes, my last question. When we discussed about the title of the lecture, first you supposed power and the end of architecture, and I said no. Something totally different because, as you know, Parik wrote one very controversial text, End of Architecture for Korean Journal, with huge reflection with colleagues and students and theoreticians. And I don't want to speak about end of architecture. Please, my last question. Just in 3 sentences, I'm thinking, what is the power of architecture? And it is missing part of this lecture.
Actually, well, the power of architecture is also woven in the end of architecture text. Because I wanted to always contrast what we're missing out with all this clampdown, with all these diversions, with all these kind of distractions. So it's all in the text, but I won't tell you.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you so much.